Hello, everyone. On behalf of Geo Institute, it is my honor to welcome you all to the Masterclass, Story World's Real Impact, Narrative Transportation and Media Influence. We are humbled today to have received participation from across age groups, sectors, and seniority levels from academia, industry, and government. Our participants comprise 22 states and 3 union territories of India, as well as more than 20 countries from around the world. Once again, a very warm welcome to you all. We all have stories that have affected us, moved us, made us laugh, cry, think, or just stayed with us in some way. Stories have taken us on terrific journeys and have often helped us make sense of the world and even know ourselves better. In today's day and age, such stories and narratives are ubiquitous and not just within our own sphere of influence. Although media narratives are often associated with entertainment, narrative messages are regularly used for persuasive and motivational purposes in marketing, health communication, and social issue messaging. These messages are most effective when audiences become immersed or are transported into the narrative world. Transporting narratives can have effects beyond the immediate enjoyment of entering the world. Stories, sometimes even fictional ones, can also lead to changes in real-world attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. Through this masterclass, we will try to describe some of the psychological processes underlying the effects of these mediated messages, highlighting the role of affective or emotional responses. Finally, it will also discuss the current directions in narrative persuasion research. Before we begin the masterclass, I'd like to invite Dr. Palak Sheth, who is the project director, to give you all a brief overview of Geo Institute. Over to you, sir. Sir, you're on mute.
Thank you, Sanchayan. Let me once again welcome you all on behalf of Geo Institute for this masterclass on Story World's Real Impact, Narrative Transportation, and the Media Influence by Dr. Green. Dr. Green, we welcome you again. Next. Let me first share the vision of our chairman and chairperson. Our chairman and chairperson, who has decided to contribute the rest of life for empowering youth of India. As a part of their vision, Geo Institute is conceived as a multidisciplinary research institute that would contribute to the nation development. Geo Institute is envisaged to create a platform for strengthening research and innovation ecosystem of India. Geo Institute will focus on solving problems of India and solving them fast. The institute will also take up global challenges in a due course to make world a better place. Geo Institute is committed to prepare a next generation of entrepreneurs, leaders for the advancement of Indian society. Geo Institute will have certain defining features that includes bringing world scholars and thought leaders to India. Every academic program will be a multidisciplinary with a strong foundation of research and innovation. We endeavor to inculcate global citizenship through international exposure and experience of all students who join Geo Institute. We also focus on building skills and attributes of risk-taking and entrepreneurship. Geo Institute, with the help of chairman and network of Reliance Industries, has constituted its governing board, having members from the diverse background with experience in institution and enterprise development. Governing body provides a strategic direction to develop Geo Institute as a world-class university. Geo Institute has also constituted a global advisory council, having a world-renowned thought leaders and institution builder from research institutions across the globe. The Global Advisory Council guides the Institute on building strong foundation of academic excellence, industry relevance, and social significance. Geo Institute has also engaged the academic advisor from eminent global institutions to guide the development of various academic and research programs at Geo Institute. Geo Institute has developed its strategic business plan, which includes to offer programs in the 7 disciplines over next 15 years. And this discipline includes computing and engineering, architecture and urban planning, media, communication and journalism, arts, humanities and social sciences, management and entrepreneurship, law, governance and policy, and medicine. Geo Institute is developing its startup campus at a Ulve in Navi Mumbai. The startup campus will be spread across 52 acres of green space and constructed area of 4 lakh square feet. Ulve is located in a close proximity of a new airport that is coming up in New Mumbai, and also it will be connected to South Mumbai by MTHL, a new sea link that is shaping up in that area. I'm sharing few images of campus for your kind reference. In parallel, Geo Institute is also developing its comprehensive second campus at a Dronagiri. The campus will be spread across 150-acre area and will have state-of-art facilities for academic, research, innovation, and entrepreneurship zone. We have already onboarded an American architect firm called Sasaki, who is preparing this master plan and specialize on university campus plans across the globe. I'm sharing some concept plan for the vision of the campus and how it will shape it up. So the another campus at Dronagiri will look like this broad areas, which will be divided in the zone, which will include medical campus, innovation district, academic and research core, as well as it will have a bare minimum ecosystem of having its own K-12 schools, sports complexes, and all other residential facility that will make this as a university town in a New Mumbai. As a part of our approach in terms of building a world-class institution, Geo Institute will launch its program in phases of startup growth and expansion. Geo Institute initially will focus on offering master's, PhD, and postdoc program in the first 5 years to build a very strong foundation of research. Geo Institute plans to launch its postgraduate program in artificial intelligence and data science and digital media and marketing communication, which has been prepared under the guidance of Dr. Larry Burnburn and Dr. Frank Mullen, respectively. We are very much ready in terms of launching this program. In parallel to this, Geo Institute is also working with a world-class academician for developing a program in the area of journalism, public health, sports management, new energy, new material, and life sciences. Geo Institute to begin its flagship program with artificial intelligence and data science. This program will be offered to the student having bachelor degree plus 2 years experience. And we are fortunate to have Dr. Larry Burnburn and Dr. Sailesh Kumar as a part of team to mentor this program for the first batch of Geo Institute. Geo Institute is also constituted an advisory committee for having experts from industry, academia, and research to finalize the curriculum of artificial intelligence and data science. Likewise, this program will have a labs developed to give a practical and collaborative experience to the students and researchers. Geo Institute has already received a confirmation of world-renowned faculties presented here to come and teach for the first batch of artificial intelligence and data science, which represent the institute like MIT, Northwestern University, Allen Institute for AI, Microsoft Research, University of California at San Diego. Similarly, Geo Institute is going to launch its flagship program in digital media and marketing communication, and the program will be offered to a prospective student of having bachelor plus 2 years of experience. And we are fortunate Dr. Sri Kalyana Raman and Dr. Frank Mullen as a program mentor to develop and deliver this program. They have vast experience in running and developing this program across the many institutions. Geo Institute also constituted advisory council for digital media and marketing communication, as well as developed a number of labs that will provide the practical and hands-on experience to the student. Geo Institute also received number of scholars confirmation who would be teaching this program, and the institute they represent includes Northwestern University, Southern Methodist University, NTU Singapore, Murdoch University, and University of Houston, to name a few. While preparing for the degree program, Geo Institute has also started offering its non-degree program. Geo Institute has already conducted a 2 executive education program. The first executive education program was conducted on AI and DS called From Automation to Intelligence, Shaping the Modern Enterprise. The program was delivered by 8 eminent academician, researcher, and industry professionals and was attended by senior 30 industry professionals working and using AI and DS. Similarly, Geo Institute has conducted its second executive education program called the Digital Media Ecosystem in October 2021. The program was delivered by 6 eminent academicians, researchers, and was attended by a batch of 30 senior industry professionals from the industry domain like retail, media, sports, entertainment, hospitality, technology, social sector, and startup. Geo Institute is also going to set up a research center called Artificial Intelligence for All, which will have a multidisciplinary approach with a focus on IoT, robotics, machine learning, quantum computing, and their application to agriculture, healthcare, retail, education, mobility, and media. Geo Institute is working with Stanford University to develop and launch a geo-digital library that in due course will become a global library for Indian knowledge and literature. And Geo Institute is very fortunate to have Dr. Michael Keller from Stanford University and our own Dr. M.G. Shivakumar, a chief librarian who is working on this plan to make it feasible. With this brief introduction of Geo Institute, we invite all of you to visit our campus in January, as we would be able to host you with the launch of program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. That was indeed a very comprehensive overview of Geo Institute. Before we start the session, just one quick note to all participants. Throughout the session, please feel free to post any questions you have for the speaker on the Q&A tab that you can see on Zoom. Avoid posting questions on chat because it's easier for us to curate them. Make sure your questions are as brief as possible and as succinct as possible. With that, I'd like to invite Dr. Sriram Kalyana Raman, who is the program chair of the Digital Media and Marketing Communications program at Geo Institute, to say a few words as well as introduce our speaker for the day. Dr. Sri is a professor of journalism at the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communications. At UF, he is the director of the Media FX and Tech Lab and is affiliated with the Online Learning Institute and is also a co-founder of the Virtual Reality for Social Good initiative. His primary research focuses on the psychology of new technologies, particularly as they inform persuasion and attitude change in online environments. In addition to all his professional and academic credentials, given that we have a session on storytelling, Dr. Shri's diverse interests in sports, movies, books, etc., makes him a very erudite storyteller as well. I'm sure he'll be willing to share a few of his anecdotes as and when we progress in the session. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Sanchayan, and welcome to all of you. Good evening to all of you in India. Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be, where you're logging in from the rest of the world. As Dr. Sheth mentioned, one of the big differentiators with Geo is it's not just the vision in terms of how it's structured with all these comprehensive programs, world-class campus, world-class facilities, with all the great people on board. But it's also to ensure that we bring in world-class researchers, scholars in so many diverse and different areas to campus and to set up these different types of institutes and work with all of us together. Sunshine laid this out very well when talking about the whole notion of stories. So we all love stories, right? And India has a great tradition of oral storytelling, so many different types of stories. Many of us remember our very first stories from sitting on our grandmother's knees. For some reason, it's always been our grandmothers who have told us these stories, not our grandfathers. But many of us have these great memories, right? And we always think about it in terms of the many different impacts that the stories have on us, right? So stories make us think in a certain way. It makes us feel in a certain way. So it moves us so much, right? And so for every storyteller, right, one thing which is always critical for the storyteller is to think about how people are absorbed by these stories or these narratives, right? So how much of these stories can really move an audience? How can they be transported into another world altogether, right? And when we talk about stories, it's not only like oral stories, we're not only talking about the print media, but we're talking about stories in so many different media platforms, right? So we're talking about it in terms of stories that we listen to in radio, right? Stories that we watch in television, and these can be television episodes and series, it can be movies. And today, when we look at the profusion of modern technologies and how technology has just had like such a dizzying impact on stories, it's even more pertinent, right? So we have stories which are based on retweets, for example. We have new technologies, immersive technologies like virtual and augmented reality, where we are creating stories for those mediums and platforms. So with all this, right, when we talk about it in terms of what's the impact of my story, right? So that's something that storytellers in every medium have been trying to answer for ever since like time immemorial. And until Dr. Green came along, there was really no way in which we could measure how people were transported into these worlds, right? So that's like such a critical aspect. So today we have the foremost scholar in terms of looking at how these stories, these narratives persuade us, how we are transported as a result of being exposed to these stories, listening to them or watching them or seeing them. So Dr. Green is the one who developed this transportation scale, and this has had like such a worldwide impact in so many different fields. Sunshine already mentioned that. Just to give you a little bit of her worldwide fame. So this article, which came out in 2000, which first spoke about how transportation is something which can be used, how it can be measured as a way to look at media impact of stories. This is now something which has been cited thousands of times. It has been something which has really led to different disciplines. It's almost like a sub-discipline. So there are plenty of conferences which are held all over the world just in honor of this work. Dr. Green herself is obviously a very accomplished scholar who has widely authored, is also very well funded, but has also got a lot of international awards, including from very diverse societies. So she's a fellow of the International Communication Association. She's a fellow for the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. And so she's got all these things, right? And lest people think that this is also very academic, does it have any industry impact? Yes, it does. So just to give you just two brief examples, I was at a climate change conference a few years ago, and there was a group from Los Angeles, and they were talking about, so they deal with climate change awareness issues and how they create stories to spread awareness. And so during a coffee break, their research director was telling me that till then they hadn't figured out how to measure the impact of their stories. And then they came across something called the transportation scale by somebody called Dr. Melanie Green. So she was so thrilled with that. A few years ago, I was doing a talk in Durban, South Africa, and one of the people there who had invited me at the Durban University of Technology was doing some work on radio and radio narratives. And then he was talking about how, you know, he wished he could measure something in terms of how people are transported with these radio narratives, and again, reference Dr. Green's work. So there's just some brief examples of, you know, how this has had like such a big impact. So it's a privilege to welcome Dr. Melanie Green, who's a world-class scholar, but also a world-class person. And it's also an especially great pleasure because she also happens to, you know, be a very dear friend. So without much further ado, Dr. Green, welcome to this Masterclass Geo Institute.
Thank you so much, Sri, for that very kind and generous introduction. And thank you to the Geo team for inviting me for this masterclass. And thank you to all of you for logging in today. Good morning and good evening, wherever you are. Really looking forward to spending a little time talking to you all about stories. I'll go ahead and share my screen now. Okay. All right, so one of the broad questions that we can ask about stories is, what do stories do? And I love this quote from Jens Eder to answer this question. And what he says is that stories make children go to sleep and soldiers go to war. And I love this quote because I think it captures two really important things about stories. One piece of that is that stories are so simple and so inviting that even children can understand them. And the second piece is that despite the simplicity, they can often be so powerful that they can inspire individual change and even broader social movements. And so we can talk about how that happens. And before I get into that, I just want to take a moment or two to talk about what is a narrative or story. Now, as you've listened to the introductions, we've heard the word story a dozen times, and I'm guessing that none of you were sitting behind your screen going, wait, what is that? What is a story? I'm confused. We all have a general sense of what a story is. But just to differentiate it from other kinds of communications or other kinds of persuasive messages, a couple broad definitions of narratives or stories have been used. So one of these is that a narrative is a message that has a dramatic arc. So it's a message that conveys events with a beginning, middle, and an end. And if you've taken any literature classes, you've probably seen a diagram similar to this one on the screen. Something happens, there's a complication, it gets resolved, and so on. And Michael Dahlstrom has identified three important elements of narratives that I think provide a nice, clear definition. And so to differentiate narratives or stories from other kinds of communications, we can think of narratives as having these three elements. So first of all, narratives have characters. They're about someone or a group of someones, and character here, of course, is broadly defined. That characters can be, aliens or monsters or mythological creatures, all of these kinds of things. Narratives also have temporality. And what that means is that they occur over time. There's a series of events that occur, again, sort of from beginning to end. And this differentiates narratives from other kinds of persuasive messages, which often make just abstract or general claims. All right, and the third piece is that narratives have causality. Within those narratives, one event leads to another. This happened, and because that happened, here comes the next thing. So all of those elements come together. And these elements can appear in long, complex stories, so soap operas or novel series, things like that. But they can also happen very, very quickly. So there's a lot of evidence that narratives can work well, even if they're quite short, a 30-second advertisement, for example. So if you think about your typical consumer narrative, a lot of times it takes the sort of form of, oh, someone's life is terrible, but wait, they buy my product and then their life is wonderful, right? So you have someone, you have events happening over time, and you have that causal effect. My product just made your life better. All of those elements come together for narratives. And the power of stories, as again, I think you heard in the introduction, has been recognized for a long time. So if you look back over the centuries, and sadly still occurring even today, censors have attempted to ban books or even burn books because of the fear of the power of stories that's contained within them. If you look back in the history of the United States, the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin was attributed with inspiring anti-slavery sentiment that eventually led to the Civil War. And then you see other more recent, although this is not terribly recent, types of narratives like the film Philadelphia that raised awareness and sympathy for people suffering with HIV and AIDS. So as you go through, there's a lot of anecdotal examples of how stories can cause even large-scale societal change. And of course, this has been recognized in the business world as well. If you look in popular press, you see a lot of urging to use storytelling in business contexts as well. So what we'll talk about today is a few different things. So first, I'll talk a little bit about the experience of stories, and in particular, how we become immersed or transported into them. And then we'll move on to, as storytellers, as communicators, how can we encourage this transported or immersed state among our audience? How do we understand that state? Then we'll look at some differences in audiences that might affect how they respond to these stories. Talk briefly about some persuasion challenges that we might face that narratives can help us overcome. And then finally, I'll mention a couple brief benefits for the storytellers themselves. It's not all about the audience. Sometimes there can be perceptions for storytellers too. All right, so transportation into narrative worlds. Think about the last time that you experienced a really good story. You might have been sitting in a movie theater, completely captivated. You might have been reading a novel that kept you up way past your bedtime, or binging a series where you knew you should go to bed instead of watching one more episode, but you just kept going with it. That experience is really this immersive experience that we're talking about. And so people talk about being taken to another world. They talk about being swept away. They talk about being lost in a book. This idea that the story world becomes your actual world, at least temporarily. And if you look across the research literature, and this has been studied across a variety of fields, so literary scholars talk about this, cognitive scientists talk about it, social psychologists, communication scholars. And so a lot of different terms have been used for this experience. So we talk about immersion, we talk about absorption or engagement or involvement. But the term that I've used in my work is transportation. And this was actually inspired by an analogy that cognitive psychologist Richard Gehrig used in his book. And he talked about narratives as transportation because, similar to actual physical travel, we go somewhere else temporarily and then we return changed by that journey. The travel expands our world, it changes our way of thinking. And so when we talk about transportation into narrative world, it's that immersive mindset. And what's important and exciting about being transported into a narrative world is that it brings together multiple mental systems. So you have your cognition engaged. You're thinking about, you're imagining that narrative world. You have your mental imagery systems engaged. And so if you're reading a text, that imagery might be imagery that you're creating in your own mind. You're generating pictures from what the author has said. Or if you're watching a visual medium, those images are provided for you. And then finally, and importantly, narratives bring together emotion. People aren't just thinking about it, but they're caring about it. They are, excited when a character succeeds. They're sad when a character fails, and they have that emotional and motivational connection with the story. And when I first started working in this area, a lot of the research on persuasion really was focused on understanding more explicit persuasive appeals. And I'm talking about traditional advertisements, editorials, things that really provided you a list of reasons why you should support a position. Here's 5 reasons why you should buy this automobile. And theories like the elaboration likelihood model told us a lot about how that kind of persuasion works. It works because people are thinking a lot or not thinking about the arguments and they evaluate them carefully. But transportation through stories happens in a different way. We have this more immersive mindset, and that opens us up to the information that's in stories, causes us to think a different way. And as Sri mentioned, an important way of being able to study how this mental state occurs and what the outcomes are of it is being able to measure it. And we measure it actually in a relatively straightforward way. We developed a self-report scale where after people are finished with a media experience, they fill out a set of questions about what that experience was like. So for example, I found my mind wandering when reading the narrative. If someone says, yeah, I found my mind wandering a lot, well, they're not very transported, right? When you're transported, you're right there in it. Your mind's not wandering. Questions like, I was emotionally involved in the narrative. When I was reading the narrative, I could easily picture the events in it taking place. And as you can probably see from these examples, these kind of map on to those different elements of transportation, the cognition, the mental imagery, the emotion. And the original scale that we developed was 11 general items, and then 3 additional items to measure specific visual images, like visual images of the characters of the settings. We've also developed a short form of the scale. This was in collaboration with Marcus Apple and some other colleagues. So for example, if people want to use this in field settings or times when you don't have the opportunity to ask people a lot of questions, there's also that well-validated short form of measuring this experience. People also, by the way, are looking into other ways of doing this, looking at physiological measures, measuring people's heart rates and so on. But that research is at the moment, I think, a little more in its infancy. And so typical studies that have investigated these effects are often experimental type of studies, either done in the lab or done in field contexts. And so in these studies, what we do is we might manipulate the story or the situation. So give people 2 different versions of a story, give them different instructions about how to approach a story, something like that. Then they actually are presented with a story. They either read something or watch something. And then afterwards, we measure the transportation and potentially other processes. So things like identifying with the characters or other kinds of psychological reactions people may have had to the story. Then we assess the beliefs or attitudes or behaviors. And typically those are beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors that are implied by the story. So often stories don't necessarily make an explicit set of arguments, but the flow of the story suggests particular attitudes. So for example, if it's a story of someone who suffered illness as a result of lifelong smoking, the implied message of the story is that, hey, maybe people should quit smoking. Right. And then sometimes we also include other measures like individual differences. What kind of personality characteristics do people have? And so on. And this work has been going on for, it seems strange to say, but about 20 years now. And the very consistent finding over a number of studies across a number of different topics, a number of different researchers, is that transportation leads to greater attitude and belief change. So when people become immersed in these stories, they're more likely to take the messages of the stories and apply it outward to the real world. And one of the things that I think is so fun and exciting about this type of research is that it applies in so many areas. So this has been investigated in health topics, it's been investigated with social issues, it's been investigated with consumer products, and these same underlying psychological processes work across a variety of domains. So how does this happen? We get immersed in the story, but why does this translate to actually changing our beliefs in the real world? What's going on there? Well, there's a few different things that underlie this transition. And one of these is that transportation aids in what the literary scholars call suspension of disbelief, and what the more psychologically oriented scholars call reduction of counter-arguing. And counter-arguing is basically if you get a message and then you come up with reasons why it's not true or reasons why not to believe it. That's counter-arguing. So someone says, here's an ad to buy this car, and you say, no, that's too expensive. That's counter-arguing. And in traditional persuasive messaging, that context often does inspire a lot of counter-arguing, because think about what happens if you're watching TV, reading a newspaper, and you see an ad. A lot of times what happens is we automatically have kind of maybe a skeptical, a cautious, or an evaluative mindset. We know someone's trying to sell us something, and we're going to kind of think hard about whether that's a good idea for us. That kind of mindset is really different than the one that we have when we're in stories. When we're in stories, we want to be entertained, we want to be immersed. So we're just going along, we're imagining the story, we're with the author on that journey. And so we're not thinking about critiques, we're not thinking about reasons why this isn't true. in part because we're not necessarily feeling like we're the targets of a persuasive attempt. So that counter-arguing tends to be reduced. Now, does that mean people never counter-argue against stories? No. But in general, transporting stories are going to reduce this counter-arguing. Second way that transportation is helpful in persuasion is that it makes narrative events seem like real experience. Now, there's a lot of research from psychology, and our common sense also supports the idea that the very best way to shape or change someone's attitude about something is give them direct experience with it, right? They try a sample of the product, they engage in a behavior. But sometimes we can't do that, right? There are some issues where that's not possible or not practical. And the idea here is that narratives have a lot of the same characteristics as our real experience. They have vivid, concrete detail. They have emotional content. We have strong imagination about them. And so all of those things sort of make narratives the next best thing to real experience because they encapsulate a lot of that same vividness and emotional impact. Okay. And then the third thing is that transportation creates attachment to characters, right? Again, think about your favorite books and movies. Those characters often seem like friends, part of your social group, or maybe you even see yourself in a character, you aspire to be a character. All of those kinds of connections make the attitudes or the experiences of the characters more influential, right? If it happened to that character, it's then meaningful to me as well. And then an additional related way that narratives can have this engagement is by creating emotional and motivational responses in an audience. So narratives can spark different kinds of emotions just because of their content. It can make people scared if you want to get them a little scared so they take action for a health issue. It can make them happy and excited if you want them to go out and engage with an issue. It can make them angry if you want to inspire outrage as a pathway toward engagement. Stories are a great way of creating those emotions. And furthermore, the pattern of what we've called emotional flow within a narrative, the transition from, oh, something good's happening, now something bad's happening, oh, I'm have suspense, oh, that suspense is resolved. Those kinds of things are also really good with keeping people engaged with your message. That flow can promote engagement and also promote attitude change. And in general, the way that stories appear to work is through a process of generalizing. Stories present a specific case or a specific event, but our minds seem to relatively automatically take that specific case and generalize it outward to our view of the world. So, for example, we've done some studies with narratives to improve attitudes towards stigmatized groups or groups that experience prejudice. And what we find is that the transporting narrative, if you tell someone's story, the story of a particular refugee, for example, what happens is people get transported into that narrative. They connect with that particular character, and that generalizes out to feeling a broader empathy for the group and even to supporting policies that support that group. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the ways that stories can have their influence. I just want to say a few more words to give you a sense of the scope that narrative influence can have. These underlying psychological processes can play through to a lot of influential outcomes. So, for example, a lot of the work has been focused on attitude and belief change. And attitude and belief change is fantastic, but sometimes we also want that to play through to behaviors. We don't just want to change what people think. We don't just want them to like our product. We also want them to purchase it or vote for our candidate or engage in a health behavior. And indeed, although the amount of research is a little bit less, narratives have been shown to be effective with behavior change as well. And so one kind of fun example of a study that we did a number of years ago was this was a study spearheaded by Mei Liang in public health. And what she did was worked with artists to create a manga comic where the main character had to eat fruit in order to become strong and defeat the enemies. It's called Fight for Your Right to Fruit. Fight for Your Right to Fruit. And it was designed for middle school children. And what she found was that reading these comics compared to other materials, either a different comic or information about the health benefits of fruit, actually led to children being more likely to select fruit as a snack immediately and being more likely to try to integrate fruit into their diet later. Narrative persuasion also persists over time. So again, in experimental research, most often these effects are observed on an immediate basis. So what happens is someone reads a story and then right away we ask them some questions. But in persuasion context, we often want to have that information persisting over time. And so there have been some studies that have looked at that as well. This is another one that we did. We took advantage of the fact that at the university that we were at, the University of Pennsylvania, they had a program where all incoming students were asked to read the same book. And for this particular year, the book was The Omnivore's Dilemma. And this is a book that kind of integrates stories with real world facts. And it's all about kind of food and meals and so on. And so what we found was that reading that book changed participants' attitudes on these related attitudes compared to people who hadn't read the book. So the blue line here are the incoming freshman students, first-year students who supposedly had read the book. And the comparison group was a different group of students, in a different class year who had not read that book. So we saw attitude change initially. Fine, that replicates a lot of what we've seen before. But then we came back the next year, 1 year later, looked at those freshmen again and compared them to the new set of incoming freshmen, most of whom who had presumably not read the book. First thing we found was that yes, there was some decrease in the attitudes. This is a super common effect in all persuasion research. You just have a drop off. There's forgetting of information, there's interference with new information. But what we found was that it was still significantly different from people who had not been exposed to the book. So we had persistence of this persuasion across the course of an entire year. And recently in 2020, there was a meta-analysis that was published. And a meta-analysis is a type of statistical technique that brings together the results of multiple studies, puts them all together to see, which effects emerge across different studies. And that meta-analysis did reveal that narratives had significant effects on persuasion over time. So they looked at studies that did test these long-term effects and found effectiveness. And in those studies, the immediate effects were mediated or partially caused by transportation. And then we also can look at narratives across media. So we can be transported into a narrative our friend tells us, we can be transported into a film, all kinds of different media are possible here. So just as a couple of examples, we had a study where we used a live theater performance of a play about interpersonal violence that had effects on those kinds of beliefs compared to a control play. We've used video narratives. So in this particular study, the person pictured here was the survivor of a tornado, and that story was able to increase pro-social desires to help people who were victims by volunteering with relief organizations and so on. And then this one at the bottom, this is another one that was kind of fun. The Brewsters is actually an interactive story. And what does that mean? Well, when I was a kid, we had stories that were called Choose Your Own Adventures. And these were stories where you would read a page and you would maybe encounter a spaceship, and then you would get to pick. It would say, all right, turn to this page if you want to go into the spaceship, turn to this other page if you want to run away. And then you could pick and you could go through different pathways in the plot. So it's sort of a fun, interactive way to get into media. And this particular story was actually used to teach medical students or health profession students about questions of medical ethics. You're faced with medical ethics choices, you make those choices, and then you see the consequences. Did that turn out right or wrong? And the cool thing about interactive narratives is that in addition to all these transportation processes, it adds in this feeling of personal responsibility. Oh, wow, I prescribed this medication to this patient, but I forgot to check for drug interactions and something bad happened. And so even though you're just going through it in a story and there's not necessarily real world consequences, that felt sense of responsibility seems to increase the memorability and the impact of that story. And as I think you can see from the examples that I've given so far, stories that are impactful don't have to be true stories. They can be fact or they can be fiction. And stories, the evidence suggests, can be not only transporting, but also persuasive, even if they're not real world truth. What seems to happen with these kinds of stories is that people actually judge more based on plausibility. So could the story be true? Are the people acting like we think real people could be acting? And not so much, do these real people actually exist? So this gives us a lot of flexibility in the kinds of narratives that we can use. Okay, so transportation is good, leads to a lot of good outcomes. How do we get people transported? How do we encourage this state? A few different ways. One of the big ones, of course, is narrative quality. You want to have a good story, but what makes something a good story? There's a variety of different factors that can go into making something a good story. I think perhaps the most important is the first one on this list, and that's coherence. Does the story flow together and fit well? Do the cause and effect links in the story make sense? Are the characters acting like they should? Because if you think of times when you haven't enjoyed a story, when you've been bounced out of that immersive state, a lot of times it's because a character does something that's totally out of character, or there's some jarring plot hole, and these things are really destructive to narrative quality. So making sure it's coherent is important. Developing the characters can contribute to that. Do we have a sense of who these people are as humans? The emotional intensity of the story, does it grab at our heartstrings? The realism of the story. And again, here, this is really more psychological realism. Do we think that these events would play out this way? It doesn't matter if it's set on another planet or something unrealistic. We can accept that kind of unrealism as long as the psychology of it seems real. The type of mental imagery that's created can be important. Production values, so you don't want poor video quality or something like that interrupting the transportation. And then particularly for narratives that are really intended to persuade, cultural appropriateness, so matching with your audience. And sometimes people might look at this list and go, oh, wow, that's a lot of stuff. That sounds hard. We've got to integrate all of these things. And interestingly, what research suggests, if you look at kind of the overall pattern of findings here, is that there are actually a lot of pathways to having a good narrative. So you don't necessarily need to have all of those things. As long as you have some elements of quality storytelling, you don't necessarily need to have all of them. So think about an action adventure movie, for instance. That may not have a ton of character development, but if it has really good, exciting emotional flow, that can get us involved in it. Or a movie may not have a lot of visual imagery, but if it has very deep character development, that can get us into it. And then you also don't want to disrupt the mental simulation or the flow of the narrative. So you need to have something good and avoid having something bad. And one of the theories about how stories work is that basically what we're doing when we encounter a story is we're running a simulation in our mind. We're creating mental models of story events. It's like we're building a track that the train of the story runs on. And if that process is easy, our brains like things that are easy. If that process is easy and it's fluent and nothing interrupts us, then we feel really engaged. But if something bounces us out of that, not so good. And so a couple of ways of encouraging transportation flow from that simulation perspective. So one of these is that people tend to get more transported into stories when they have some similarity to the character or some familiarity with the situations the characters are in. And the graphic up here are the logos of social groups called sororities and fraternities that we have at some colleges in the United States. And in one of our early studies, what we did was we had people read a story that was set in a fraternity, and we had people who were either members of those groups or not members of those groups read the story. Turns out that the people who were members of the group were more transported into the story and more persuaded by the story. And the interesting thing about that study is that that happened even though the story itself was actually fairly critical of fraternities. It was sort of highlighting the negative things that happened, but nonetheless, the fact that the participants could easily imagine it got them more immersed into it. Similarly, anything that increases those feelings of fluency or connection can be helpful. So kind of fun study run by Leanne Vaughn, a researcher at Ithaca College, had people read a story that was set in wintertime. And so, you know, kind of a cold, snow, etc. But she had them read it either in the winter when it looked like this outside, or in the spring. And what she found was that the people reading the winter story in the winter were actually more transported into it. And the idea was that they already had all of those winter ideas at the top of their mind. They were already thinking about snow and hot chocolate and these sorts of things. So it was very easy to slip into that narrative world. It was a shorter distance to travel, to use that analogy. And I will note that the similarity to a character or familiarity with situations can actually be fairly broad. It can be something as broad as, oh, wow, that person is struggling and I know what it's like to struggle. Or that person's encountering a difficult relationship and I've had a difficult relationship of that sort. So it doesn't necessarily mean that your characters have to be exactly the same as your audience, as long as you kind of have some type of connection. And so that's one of the take-home points here, is that if you can find some sort of entry point to help your story connect with your audience in some way, what's going to resonate with your audience, what's going to have that similarity that will help them connect and get into the story. And the kind of cool thing about literature and stories is that once you have them, once they've connected with that character, you can then go other places, right? One of the reasons for reading literature and stories is to experience lives outside of our own, worlds very different from our own. And so once we've connected with a character, we're willing to go on that journey with them, learn these new things. So another way of connecting with characters that's often very, very closely related to transportation is called identification. So identifying with a character, putting yourself in the character's shoes, having that merging between yourself and the character. And research suggests that there are ways that we can encourage identification as well. So one of these is very simple. If you have a story that's told from a first-person perspective, or kind of shows things, even if it's not from the first-person perspective, where the story is, I did this, I did that, if you're showing it from the character's eyes, like seeing sort of what they're seeing, that tends to encourage identification. We can also give people instructions sometimes. Imagine what the character's feeling, put yourself in their shoes. So sometimes if people are motivated to do that, that helps as well. And then a third way that we can create identification is that there's a theory called affective disposition theory, developed by Zillman and his colleagues. And basically the idea here is very simple. When we first encounter a story, if there's multiple characters, we want to figure out which one to identify with, we go for the hero. Who's the good character? Who's the character that is doing the right things? Boom, we're going to identify with that character. So if the main character is, you know, a selfless doctor who's going back to her home village and helping people, we like that. And that sort of very quickly encourages identification. So when you're creating a story, those are all different ways that you can try to encourage that type of connection. Now, I've given you a variety of hints about how to create effective stories. So elements of narrative quality, ways of creating connection, identification, and so on. But, you know, sometimes when people hear that I study narratives and I've been doing that for a long time, they want to know, okay, tell me, what's the secret? What's the secret to storytelling? How can I create a great story every time? And if you go to a library or whatever, you'll find books on the secrets of storytelling and things like that. A lot of good advice, in those types of things, but it's not foolproof. There's not a magic solution. There's not something that's going to work every time. I'm sorry to tell you this, but just think about Hollywood, Bollywood. Sometimes people are paid millions and millions of dollars to make a film. They put that film out there and it's a flop, right? So even people who do this for a living, doesn't always work. So that's why I want to emphasize to you, if you're someone who's pursuing this, is that a really important step in your process should be what's called formative research or pre-testing. And this is basically the idea that once you've developed your story, check it out with your intended audience, right? And this is especially important if the people creating the story are different in some way from the actual audience. If you're a group of adults trying to create a story for a group of middle school kids, or a group of younger adults trying to create a story for older adults, something like that. Get a group of people who are similar to the ones that you want to reach and see what they think. And this is often incredibly, incredibly valuable in developing narrative interventions, because they can point out things that are going to be problems that you didn't know were problems. Okay, so that's a little bit about stories, a little bit about the psychology, what happens when we get involved in stories. Next, I want to mention a few things that are audience factors. Who's more likely to become transported? And a couple of individual differences or personality variables have gotten a lot of investigation. And one of these is what we very simply call transportability. And this is the simple idea that some people just naturally, whatever the story is, they're excited and they're going to get into it. You know, these are the people where they see that 30-second commercial where the soldier's coming home from war to his grandmother, and, you know, by the end of it, they're grabbing a tissue, you know, because they're so affected by it. Possibly that's me, you know, and so they just, whatever the story is, they're likely to get into it. And other people are just not story people. They'd rather have the facts. They'd rather just cut right to the chase. Those people are what we call low in transportability, and they're likely to be less affected by stories. So, you know, stories are effective, but sometimes they're differentially effective across people. Okay. Second factor that goes along with that is one that's an individual difference called need for affect. And need for affect refers to the idea that some people love to experience a lot of emotions. They like to be really happy or really sad or afraid. And those people who are high in this need, also tend to be more engaged in stories, right? Stories are emotion machines. They're a great way to create emotions, and need for affect draws people to that. Does that mean that stories can't be effective even if people don't have these tendencies? No, not at all. It's just that they're more likely to be affected by stories if they're higher in transportability or higher in need for affect. Other kinds of things that also seem to be related to narrative experience. One is a broad personality variable. It's one of the big 5 personality variables that's called openness to experience. And these are people that like to experience new things. They like to travel. They like to, see different things in the world, as opposed to, just wanting tradition and having things the same. Those people tend to be more engaged in narratives. Similarly, empathy kind of seems to be a two-way street. People who have higher empathy are also more likely to relate to narrative characters. But then also there's some really cool evidence that lifetime reading, if you read a lot of fiction or literature over your lifetime, that also seems to improve people's social skills, their ability to understand and recognize the emotions of other people. So that's kind of cool that it works that way. And then there's also individual differences that affect the type of narratives that are more effective for people. So there's something called sensation seeking, where some people, they like risk, that, they're the skydiving roller coaster, people like that. Those people go for more high arousal stories and media. They're going to go for the action adventure, the horror films, those kinds of things, where people who are low in sensation seeking are going to prefer more calm types of media. And then finally, there's an individual difference called need for cognition. And that means how much people like to think, how much they like to put mental effort into things. People who are high in need for cognition like to debate, they like to solve puzzles, they like to really think about things. That's fun for them. And this actually interacts with media type. So people who are high in need for cognition are more likely to be engaged in media that requires more effort, so written texts or interactive narratives. Whereas people low in need for cognition, who don't really have that same type of interest, might be more engaged with films or things that don't require as much input from the reader or the audience member. Okay, so stories in general can also help you overcome a lot of persuasion challenges. Okay, and I'll just run through these, give you kind of the overview here. So sometimes we have the challenge that we want people to pay attention to our message. People have a lot of stuff going on. We need to get their attention. Stories can be useful for that because stories are interesting and entertaining. People seek out narrative entertainment. And so this can kind of be a way to get people to pay attention to our message by making it something fun and engaging for them. Second, sometimes people have resistance or reactance to persuasive messages. In essence, reactance refers to the idea that people do not like being told what to do. If someone's shaking their finger in your face and saying, you got to do this, our first reaction is to say, no, I don't. You don't tell me what to do. And sometimes our persuasive messages can come off that way. They come off too strong. But stories are kind of a nice way around that, because it's not, oh, I'm telling you to quit smoking. It's just, hey, I'm telling you this story about this person who didn't quit smoking, and then a lot of bad stuff happened. So stories kind of seem inviting. They have a little bit of distance. It's not about us necessarily. So they seem less threatening and more inviting. So it can overcome that resistance in some cases. Additionally, sometimes people don't care about an issue. Things seem abstract. They seem too far away. Something, again, like climate change or global warming. But stories can bring that down to a human level and make it seem more personal. So, okay, maybe I don't understand the science of carbon dioxide and blah, 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 but maybe a story of how, my grandfather used to go fishing in this lake, and now nobody can go fishing in that lake because it's dried up or because, the seasons have changed. Those kinds of things can bring these issues to a more personal level, make them more impactful. And then sometimes an issue feels too complicated, right? A medical treatment or something like that. It just people might feel like, I can't get my head around that. I can't understand it. But stories, again, because they're simple, they provide that cause and effect structure, they can sometimes make the information more accessible to people as well. So these are different persuasion challenges that narratives can help us overcome. And then additionally, stories in general, they can show people what to do. There's a wonderful and extremely influential theory developed by Albert Bandura called social cognitive theory, also called social learning theory. And this is the simple but powerful idea that we learn from watching others. And so if you've taken an introductory psychology class, these images may be familiar to you. He did his early studies with this object here called a Bobo doll. And what happened was when young children saw adults acting aggressively toward this Bobo doll, beating it up, hitting it, and so on, they imitated that behavior. So this was originally done to see about learning of violence and things like that and aggression. But this is really broadly applicable. And this theory has formed the basis of a lot of work in what's called entertainment education. And this is the idea that having vicarious experience by watching a character go through something can really influence how we think about it. And so one of the nice things that stories can do is that we can see the effects of rewards and punishments on others. So a character follows a good course of action, we see them get rewarded. A character follows a bad course of action, we see them having bad consequences. And so the theory suggests that we're very sensitive to that. We want to imitate the actions that are rewarded, and we don't want to imitate the actions that are punished. So that can be a powerful thing. And then this also helps promote self-efficacy. If we see a character succeed at a difficult task, the character learns to read. We feel like we can do it too. So it can kind of increase that motivation and sense of power among the audience as well. And just briefly, this has been explored in a lot of different ways. So we used it in a video game to help people raise awareness of seeking treatment for heart attacks quickly. So getting people to call medical services if they were having a heart attack. Don't stall, make the call if you're having heart attack symptoms. We were able to use that to show people the healthy approach. Again, stories of marginalized groups like refugees. This can increase positive feelings toward them. And if you're interested in this area, I really recommend looking at the books by scholars such as Arvind Singhal and Everett Rogers. The book that I've shown here has a ton of just amazing examples of this approach. All right. And then I just want to close with mentioning briefly that stories don't just affect how we think about the content of the story, but it can also affect how we think about the person telling the story in kind of an interesting way. So research on source perception, how we think about other people, suggests that when we encounter another person, we fairly quickly make two broad judgments about them. The first one is we determine how warm is this person? Is this person friendly? Is this person trustworthy? What do we think they're a warm person? And then the second element is their competence. Is this person smart? Can they get things done? And so on, their intelligence. So warmth and competence, two primary dimensions of source perception. And there are certain communication contexts where this can be a challenge. And one of these in particular is science communication. So if you look at surveys, at least in the United States, one thing that's emerged is that people, when people are asked to rate various professions on warmth and competence, scientists show up as being very competent. We think they're smart, we think they know what they're doing, but kind of cold. We don't necessarily like them, we don't necessarily trust them. And so this can be a barrier when a scientist is trying to communicate about science rather. If we kind of feel like we don't like them or trust them, that can be a barrier to the message getting through. So we were wondering, can stories change that, right? Stories can help humanize. And indeed, in a set of studies that we ran, what we did was we looked at having a communicator convey roughly the same information, but either conveying it using a story or conveying it using a more research statistical-based message. And what we found was that the storytellers or the communicators who use stories were perceived as more warm. We also, by the way, did see evidence of the flip effect that using the statistical argument made people being perceived as more competent. So it's interesting, again, stories are often fantastic, but they're not always the right way to go. And so it may be that if you feel like you really need to establish that warmth and connection, go for a story. If you really need to establish competence, use the statistical type of thing. But again, these often kind of go together. We often think people are both warm and competent because we might have a general positive attitude toward them. And then additionally, in a different set of studies, we also found some evidence that people who are good storytellers, people who really can draw others in and tell these good coherent stories, they're perceived as having higher status or as being able to achieve higher status. So there's several benefits from both being a storyteller and being a good storyteller. All right, so taking you now on this journey through a variety of different aspects of narratives, how they work psychologically and their influence. And so just to kind of sum up a couple of points, stories work by transporting people or immersing them into these narrative worlds. And once people are immersed, we can have a whole range of effects on attitudes and behaviors. And these stories can also help us overcome some common barriers or persuasion challenges. So when you're using your stories, be sure to pay attention to narrative quality. Also consider your audience. And these stories can have benefits for storytellers by increasing their perceptions of warmth. So I hope this information will be useful to you as you head into your next chapters. I really appreciate your attention and I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Green. That was indeed a very well-woven narrative of narratives, if I can put it that way. So yeah, we have actually quite a few questions throughout the session. So I'll try and take as many as I can, given the limited time we have left. So first question. So the question says that, would you say that stories that are largely propelled by agent causation have higher transportation scores than stories largely propelled by event causation? So for the participants, agent causation indicates plots that are driven strongly by choices, conflicts, and personalities of characters, while event causation are plots that are driven mostly by a series of events causing other events, including logical series of events or coincidental ones. So just to repeat the question, will there be any persuasive or transportation effects on the basis of this difference?
Yeah, that is actually, it's a really interesting question. And I don't think that there's been a lot of formal study of that question in particular. You know, we tried to do some studies a few years ago where we looked at whether there would be different persuasion, you know, based on whether it was character versus other events in the story. And the results were a bit mixed. So my guess is that actually probably both of them would be transporting and work well, because other research, for example, Michael Dahlström's research suggests that really that causal chain is kind of what we remember. So yeah, I think they could both work, although possibly in different ways. That might be a case of those different pathways getting to the same idea. But it's a really interesting question. I think that might be an area where additional research could be really helpful as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Green. Dr. Sri, also feel free to jump in with any of these questions at any point. So the next question we have is, so Dr. Green, one question says that we prefer stories that are more relatable and are easy to understand. But there are many examples where very complex and completely unrelatable stories become so famous that people remember them for ages. I mean, the example given is that of Inception. So the participant says that some of his friends who don't have any interest or knowledge of astronomy still vividly remember that movie. And Inception is just one example. Why are these kinds of stories, which are so complex and so unrelatable, still so famous?
Well, I think sometimes some of those stories attract us because the narrative suspense and kind of figuring out the problems, like, so, and I think that actually highlights it. I'm really glad that question was asked, because I think it highlights a good point, is that just because certain things make it easier for us to be transported, right? Like we're more sort of quick and easy to get transported into stories that maybe are simple and connect with us. It totally doesn't mean that we can't connect with other stories. It's just sort of, it makes it more likely, or maybe more people are able to get into it. But I think these complex stories, right, they do have, again, they have the narrative suspense which keeps us engaged. They have the problem solving and kind of exploration, which are other motivations that we can meet through doing a story. So I think they work, again, through slightly different pathways. There's also, not to spend too long answering this, but there's also, it's similar to a sort of dichotomy in this research literature, where there's people who study literary texts and people who study more popular texts. And there's also to some extent different kind of readers that enjoy those different kinds of things. And so the kind of types of mental experiences that people might have beyond transportation can be a little bit different. So, okay, we're just reading something interesting, we're just watching a sitcom or something genre. That's really easy. It kind of gives us emotional experiences. We enjoy it. But then getting into something complex is harder, but then maybe also gives us additional benefits. So it might make us think differently about the world. It might give us a stronger sense of meaning. It might be an intellectual challenge. So it does sort of bring in different mental processes as well. Yeah, these are great questions. Thank you.
So since you mentioned, how different people respond to stories very differently. So India is a very diverse country. I mean, we have practically a lot of countries merged into one when it comes to, the different cultures, languages, everything. So there have been a number of cases in India, and I will not go into details, where narratives have known to cause some kind of outrage with different sections of society because of different sensitivities. So the question is, what approach should one take to form a narrative which will not hurt sentiments, but also state the fact as they are and bring the change that the author of the narrative is looking to achieve? Or should the facts be completely ignored, which will not serve the purpose of the person at all? I mean, basically, the question is, how do we achieve a balancing act, especially in complex societies and diverse societies like that in India?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very challenging question. And I think the research on entertainment education is somewhat instructive there, because even today, but particularly looking back at some of the early years, there was a lot of work in Latin American countries and things like that. And they really were addressing somewhat sensitive topics like family planning, like domestic violence, things like that. And they were topics that had been, somewhat taboo to talk about. But in some cases, sort of bringing them in the context of the story made them somewhat more acceptable. And then also, in some ways, a delicate balancing act between, okay, we can maybe talk about this in this context, but not that context. So like, okay, maybe we can talk about family planning for married people, but we're not going to talk about, that for unmarried people, because that would sort of, be a step too far given the norms in that society, things like that. So it is, I think there's not a perfect solution, but I think sometimes also this sense of easing into it in a way, like if you have characters that people already like and sort of a storyline that's already established, and then you can kind of bring in that stuff, sometimes that works, but it is delicate because people do react differently to different stories, and sometimes there's not going to be an easy solution. Sri,
Just a
anything
very
to
quick
add.
follow-up on that. I mean, when you were answering this
Mhm.
question, one thing that immediately came to mind is, of course, narrative persuasion can be very effective in policy making, right? I mean, it's something that's
Mhm.
right in there. So do you think like this is the reason why it's not so predominantly followed in policy making, although the area is pretty relevant for this sort of narrative persuasion across different societies?
Mhm.
So is there
Yeah.
why how?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's an interesting question, because I think anecdotally people will say, oh yeah, that the storytelling is powerful. So right, here in the US, one of the like recommendations is, oh, okay, if you're trying to talk to policymakers, it really helps to have, oh, here's a story of your constituent who's affected by this policy, those kinds of things. I think policymaking is complicated because there's just so many people involved. So, does the story get to the actual decision maker? What happens within negotiation processes? So I think it does play a role, but identifying clearly when and how it plays a role can be, I think, a more complicated process. There's a researcher named Jeff Niederdeppy who's at Cornell University, and he's actually done some really cool research because he's actually tested narrative versus non-narrative messages with policymakers. And again, it's not a simple answer. So the stories in some cases seem to be effective, but there does seem to be some variation among issues and pre-existing political commitments and so on. So yeah, I mean, stories are good, but they don't solve all the problems, and that's true here as well.
Absolutely. So the reason I also asked is because it clearly seemed like something that we've not done enough, and something that's very related to behavior change. So talking about behavior, one of our questions was also that, so it begins very abruptly, like, why are people reading so less? So I think the larger context of the question is that despite the rich culture of stories that we have, it is rather sad to see how people are reading less and are being led by other person's creative canvas, be it a film or audio. So I think the larger, if I were to broaden the question a little bit, where does the medium come in terms of storytelling, especially today when, as the person is asking, reading is become more and more less, and to broaden it a little bit, attention spans are becoming very, very difficult to hold.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. And it's interesting because, right, even though people are reading less, they're consuming a lot of visual media. People are watching a lot of Netflix and online videos and things like that. And there was actually, I don't know how this translates to reading, but I saw a statistic recently that during the pandemic, so 2020, when people were inside, was actually among recent years, like the highest number of book orders in recent years. So, it's interesting that maybe when people were sort of quarantined and had to stay in, maybe some of it's just a matter of our busy modern lives. And so then people suddenly had time to read when they didn't previously. But yeah, there's a lot of speculation that with kind of the fast pace of videos and the ease of that kind of stuff, that it's potentially changing something about people's minds and making them less willing or able to focus on long form fiction and reading and things like that. So yeah, it's an intriguing question. It's not one that I have a great answer for, though. Oh, but to your broader question though about medium, yeah, it's interesting because it does seem that the same immersion, a lot of the same underlying psychology happens across media, but in a lot of cases it is just easier, when it's a visual media, because everything's provided for us. So we don't necessarily have to be thinking hard. We don't necessarily have to be concentrating hard. And it's not that we can't, right? Some, like Inception, right? Some is like, oh, what's going to happen next? And what about this? And let me form a theory about that. But we have the option with a lot of visual media to just be more lazy about it, so to speak. So it might be that it just appeals to a broader range of people, but also a broader range of mental states, whether you're tired or energetic or those kind of things.
So I think we have time for a couple of more questions. So there is one question which, what is the difference between transportability in a story and the hypnotizability, if I'm pronouncing that correctly? So, and there is also a reference. Yeah, there's also a reference given on some research which has been done on hypnotizability in Harvard or Stanford scale, something on that of that sort.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because this was something like way back when I was a graduate student, actually, and we were first developing this line of research. We kind of, looked into those links, and there's some other researchers that have done a little. I mean, I don't think there's a ton of work on like that particular link. But it does seem that a lot of the, maybe not a lot, but at least one important underlying personality disposition that's been called absorption seems to actually underlie both. And so it's the idea that some people are a little more willing to sort of, there was a cool wording in one of these scales, but it was like loosen the boundaries of the self. And so kind of relaxing that and being willing to enter into the kind of altered mental states or, accept perspectives of other people. So I think there is kind of that core similarity that we're kind of having our minds in a different place, and that perhaps personality difference of tendency towards absorption seems to be similar to both. So yeah, it's a fun area of intersection, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we have time for one last question. Dr. Sri, would you ask the last question?
No, I mean, I think there are some really terrific questions. So I'm going to ask a question which actually Dr. Contractor has raised, which given his background in the medical sciences. So the question, Melanie, is the area of health behavior change. I know that's something which you have looked at quite a bit. So is there any evidence whether fear works better, or whether, so is it the carrot or the stick which works better in narrative, in crafting narratives?
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's a question. And if there's time, I'll just end with one more.
Sure. I'll answer that one quickly. And that one is that in my reading, the results seem to be mixed. So there's like people that have looked at stories of survivor versus death narratives, in terms of health persuasion. And it does not, in my view, at this point, appear to be a consistent pattern. I mean, I think probably the best knowledge that we have right now is that sort of fear and then relief narrative pattern. So like basically here you're susceptible to this disease, but wait, here's an action you can take. So the problem and then the efficacy information that's sort of been established with fear appeals more generally, that seems likely to be the same in narratives, is my sense of the literature there. Yeah. Did you have a last question as well? If we have a moment.
We have time. Yeah. So yes, Dr. Sri, would you want to go ahead with the next question, or?
Sure. There's just so many great questions, difficult to choose.
Yeah. So Dr. Larry, I think, has a question.
Yeah. Larry, you want to ask that question? Okay.
So I'll go ahead and ask. So Dr. Larry asks that, is there a big difference between deliberate storytelling, like for example, writing or putting on a play, versus spontaneous and informal storytelling? So related to that, when people in groups tell a story, someone often responds with another story. Any research on how those chains of stories develop?
Oh, that's a fascinating question too. Yeah, it's so Roger Schenck had a book back in sort of the mid-90s and making the claim that all thinking is storytelling. And basically that was the argument, that that's really how we think and how we communicate, is we tell stories and we chain, stories onto each other's stories. So yeah, I think there is a sense of that. And it's interesting because, right, it's like, what do we take from the stories? And that's a way of being responsive by kind of saying, oh, I've had this experience too. And so I think there's some evidence that that can be good for like relationship building, because it kind of increases the self-disclosure. This is a little different than the question that's asked, but there's also some interesting research on how stories change. I hear a story, I tell it to you, what's different about it, what stays the same, and that can kind of get at the mental structures that go underneath it. So yeah, that's an interesting area as well. I think maybe that didn't answer the first part of the question, is there a difference between these types of stories? And I think the key similarity probably underlying them is that the core is that causal chain and that emotion that goes with them. But then, you maybe have additional elements that are unique to each one. But my sense is that they're more similar than different if you look at the psychological processes that they invoke.
Thank you, Dr. Green. I mean, we still have quite a few questions. So what I will do is on this end of the session, maybe send you some of these questions and maybe you can respond so we can get the answers back to the participants.
That would be great. I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah,
that sounds really good.
Yeah, so over to Dr. Sri.
Okay, I know we are nearly out of time, so I just want to conclude by thanking Dr. Green again for such an enlightening talk. So many questions. I do want to mention that this is precisely the type of thing that we're also trying to build at GEO. So Dr. Shade spoke about the AI for Good Center, but hopefully we can also think about having a center for storytelling for the social good, using the expertise of people like Dr. Green. I also do want to mention that for the digital media and marketing communications program, one of the core courses will be on persuasion and human behavior, and that's actually something which has been created with some inputs from Dr. Green. And we hope that you will be able to come to Navi Mumbai and teach that class in person. So once again, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much. And over to Mr. Pramod Jain.
Thank you, Dr. Sri. So the Masterclass series is our endeavor to bring global scholars, thought leaders, and experts to present their research and case studies and foster discussions and exchange of ideas. On behalf of the entire GEO Institute team, it gives me immense pleasure to extend heartfelt thanks to Dr. Melanie Green for an enriching and interactive session. Thank you, Dr. Green. I would also like to take this opportunity to express profound gratitude to our visionary founders, Mrs. Neeta Ambani and Mr. Mukesh Ambani, for their commitment to develop this world-class multidisciplinary research institute for India. We are also grateful for the valuable guidance and unwavering support of our Chancellor, Dr. Maselkar, and Vice Chancellor, Dr. Deepak Jain. Thank you, sirs. We are also highly appreciative of the leadership and mentorship provided to us by Frank Mulhan, Dr. Sriram Kalyana Raman, whom you all heard just now, Dr. Larry Birnbaum, and Dr. Shailesh Kumar for the development of academic programs and bringing world-class scholars.
We have been extremely delighted to host participants from around the world. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed participating in this session. We have a series of exciting events lined up. We look forward to welcoming you all for our future events. With that, I would like to conclude this session and wish you all a pleasant evening and best wishes for Happy Diwali. Thank you.
Thank you, Pramod sir. Once again, thank you, Dr. Green, Dr. Sri. That was a wonderful session. And most of all, thank you to all participants for joining in. And as Pramod sir mentioned, have a great weekend and also a very happy and prosperous Diwali to all the Indian participants. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.